I know many of you, but some people I don't know. It's great to see everybody out there. I'm Glenn Ruga, the founder and director of the Social Documentary Network. And this event tonight is presented by the Social Documentary Network, Bridge Gallery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Digital Silver Imaging in Belmont, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. And this event was originally scheduled to be in person at the Bridge Gallery, but because of COVID, that just became impossible. So we decided to go virtual. But in the end, we really have a much larger audience, and looking at the people who've registered, the people from all over the US and all over the world. So that's really exciting. And that's something we couldn't do in person, although we certainly miss flesh and blood and being able to congregate with people in person. So welcome. Some of us are live at the Bridge Gallery tonight. I'm in my home in Concord, but Matilde and Greg from the gallery are both at the gallery tonight. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the SDN website, to the SDN YouTube channel following. So just remember that anything that you say can and will be used against you in a court of law in some future date. So just be aware that this is being recorded. We're very excited to be here with Matilde Simas, who'll be talking about human trafficking and particularly her work in the Philippines. And before I turn this over to the moderator, I'd like to remind or announce to our viewers that Social Documentary Network is holding a call for entries right now for the Zeke Award on the topic of sustainable solutions to the climate crisis. There's a deadline of January 21st. So if anybody's working in that area, we would encourage your submissions. And the two first place winners of the award will each win a $2,500 award. So Greg Crana from the director of the Bridge Gallery will be the host for this evening. So let me turn this over to Greg.
Slide into view here. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming out. Well, I guess you didn't come out. I'm Greg Crana. I'm the founder and director of Bridge Gallery here in Cambridge, Mass. I founded this gallery 3 years ago after 40 years as a professional photographer. My intention being to promote photography and photographers and keep good photography in front of the general public. And that's pretty much what we've been doing for 3 years. It's been an interesting time keeping the gallery going under COVID restrictions, but we've done a pretty good job. For 3 years in a row, we partnered with the Social Documentary Network and Eric Ludens at ESI to put up the Zeke Awards show here in the gallery. And this year is a little bit different. Rather than just showing the winners, I decided to curate a show from numerous, from 100 people. So before I introduce Maddie or Matilde, I want to just give you a quick 30-second video of what the gallery looks like and what the show looks like hanging. And my guy here is going to hit the button, and hopefully it's going to take off. So one of my goals this year was to try to show the diversity of the photographers who are involved in the Zeke Awards and in the Social Documentary Network. These photographers are from all over the world. They're working in all different types of places with different stories that they're obsessed with. And unfortunately, a lot of you aren't in the area. I encourage anybody who is in the area to go on the website and check out the hours at bridge.photos and try to get in and see this show. So this originally had planned, it was supposed to be a live in-person thing, but it's actually kind of worked out better this way. We can only put 25 people on the gallery. And this way we can show this to a lot more people and introduce Matilde's work to more people. So with no further ado, Matilde Simas is a Boston-based photographer, and she has been working in human trafficking as well as other stories. She's a humanitarian and is pushing hard to get her agenda out in front of people. And tonight will be one of those occurrences where you will see. So I'm going to turn it over to you and back off.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for all of you tuning in for this discussion on human trafficking and on documentary work. I'd like to just say a special thank you to both Glenn and Greg for having me.
Oh, she is.
Imagine you're a 9-year-old girl. You're spending your days not in school, but cooking and cleaning for a family in a wealthy suburb. Or you're a young mother and you're struggling to make ends meet. You're lured away from your children by an illegitimate job agency and you're forced to work in sex work abroad. For millions of people, this is a reality. Human trafficking takes in a whopping $150 billion annually, and it affects about 40.3 million people. But despite its place as the second largest criminal industry in the world, human trafficking receives far too little attention. In 2017, I began an organization named Capture Humanity. Capture Humanity brings together photographers, writers, and filmmakers who are passionate about telling the stories of human trafficking survivors. To carry out this work, we partner with non-governmental organizations around the world that support trafficked survivors. And we visit the survivors to create portraits as we listen to their stories. At the core of our work is the belief that visual documentation can be a powerful way to educate people and a catalyst for change. What I'm doing is fairly uncommon, that a photographer is offering their services in a therapeutic way to survivors. Since many of the people that I photograph suffer from post-traumatic stress, I have to be extremely careful in the gathering and in the sharing of their testimonials. The photos are then used by NGOs in brochures and in their annual reports, and even on their websites. But our goal really is to leverage storytelling to inform people about human trafficking, provoke discussion, and ultimately inspire action. Capture Humanity pitches stories to media outlets. We create exhibitions. We strive to really exhibit the work in public spaces and also in museums where the general public can engage with the work. This is the most difficult part of our work, finding outlets to share these stories because the topic is so uncomfortable. But human trafficking is a horrible crime. It's where a trafficker forces someone to do something they don't want to do, and the trafficker makes money off of it. A common form of human trafficking is sex trafficking. Traffickers target young women, and also sometimes young men who are vulnerable. They trick them or force them into doing sex work. And before they know it, they're being forced to sell themselves and give the money to the trafficker. And if they don't, the trafficker threatens to harm them or they threaten to harm someone in their family. There are many forms of human trafficking, and this is just one of many forms. I'll be discussing some of these forms today. So like I mentioned, there are different forms of human trafficking, and in every country, it looks a little different. The project I'm going to share with you today takes us to the Philippines. And in the Philippines, there are two prevalent forms of trafficking: child domestic work and cyber sex trafficking. To document this, I partnered with a non-governmental organization named Voice of the Free that works to provide shelter, medical, psychological support, and education to child survivors of human trafficking. So in the Philippines, many of these victims, they come from rural mountain villages, and they're intrigued by the promise of a well-paid job by someone that might come into their village and act like They work for a job agency, so they offer them a job in the city. They believe they're leaving their impoverished life for an opportunity to earn money, but instead they get entangled in really it's a nightmare what they end up being entangled in. This particular photo is of a child victim. She is 15 years old. She is from a small village. She was recruited by a job agency to work for a family in Manila. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, looking after small children without any payment. During her time working for this family, she was not allowed to leave the house. She rarely spoke or saw her own family. Every day she was verbally abused. She said the isolation was the worst part of her experience. So in the Philippines alone, there is an estimated 1 million domestic workers. And most of these domestic workers are children, and some of them are as young as 9 years old. So these children, they're deprived of a life's chance of schooling and self-development. They're typically isolated from their family. They're kept from making friendships, and they suffer sometimes really extreme forms of physical, verbal, and sometimes even sexual abuse. Cyber trafficking, cyber sex trafficking, is the other sinister form of modern day slavery in the Philippines. It's the live sexual abuse of children streamed on the internet. Children are directed in real time by a predator located anywhere in the world. Now, this is really sick stuff. Parents are taking their kids and they're making them do sexual things in front of a webcam for someone who's willing to pay for it. It's really horrible. I later learned that according to the National Crime Agency, buyers of live stream child abuse are coming from Western countries. In the Philippines has also been identified as a global epicenter of live stream sexual child abuse. And now, in the last 2 years, because of COVID-19, incidences of online sexual abuse of children has more than doubled. And this is when I met Mary Ann, a young girl you see here in the photograph. She's a 9-year-old girl. She was admitted to one of Voice of the Free shelters after reporting that she was being exploited in front of a webcam by her dad. And this is really common. While I was there, I heard many stories of parents exploiting their children this way. Many people think that, this is organized crime, but these are families that are exploiting their own children, and it's really happening. The root cause is really, it's due to poverty. And a lot of parents, they don't see this as being harmful to their kids because it's not physical touch, but sometimes it is physical touch. And regardless of whether or not it's physical touch, it's an extreme form of child abuse. So when I'm working on a project like this, I like to begin with creating portraits. I find that it's a sort of a way to break the ice. It gives me a chance to talk to my subject and get to know them. And it gives me a chance to also share a little bit about myself. And so we start building trust. So for this particular project, I introduced myself to the group of survivors living at Voice of the Free's long-term living center. And I explained, why I was there. I left the door open to anyone who wanted to volunteer to be photographed or simply ask me questions about the work that I do. And a couple of days later, a few of the girls asked me to make their photograph. I feel like my portrait making is really, I like it to be a joint collaboration with the person I work with. And I find that when I put that person first, the stories eventually, they just come, and then the photography is made. For me, really, the most important part of this process is the relationship that I'm creating with the person that I'm working with. So in these portraits, there is a common thread. The girls decided they wanted the portraits to be done in a garden. They refer to this garden as a healing garden. It happens to be a garden at the shelter that the girls use to meditate. So you might see leaves, you might see flowers, elements of nature in these portraits. And there's also this element of shadow. The girls wanted to express that they are stepping out of a shadow world and are still working on their recovery. And some of them are not quite ready to be fully exposed. So there are 12 portraits in total. I encourage anyone who is interested in seeing more of these portraits to please visit my website and you can view more of them. So this portrait session really became a group collaboration. I really enjoy working in a dynamic like this. We all sat together, we discussed the portraits and their meaning. It gave each of the girls an opportunity to share their thoughts and feelings. And really, despite the trauma that these survivors have endured, they were all really eager to participate in this project. I even had some survivors that had already been reintegrated back into their own communities that found out about the project and came to the shelter to ask if they could be if they could be photographed and be part of the project as well. And so the group of survivors explained to me that they don't want to be forgotten and that they want everyone to know what happened to them. And I think that being able to tell your own story and take control of your own personal narrative was incredibly empowering for them and ideally helped them to come to terms with their experience. It's one small step in their recovery, and it helped them feel, confident and regain some of their self-esteem. So often I photograph subjects participating in their daily activities. I never know when or where a person is going to open up about their experience. When a person begins to talk, I ask if I can record the conversation. I start prompting them with questions about how are they feeling about their reintegration, or how are they feeling about their goals, their recovery. And in some cases, many subjects even write down their testimonials for me. But at the shelter that I stayed in, there were actually 2 shelters that I worked in. So I really noticed that survivors are being treated with a lot of dignity and a lot of respect. In the care of this nonprofit, they're given time to heal, and they're given a choice to participate in peer counseling. Once they're ready, they're given equal authority to run daily operations. They're sharing responsibilities in the shelter, and they're learning life skills. In this particular photo, you see 3 teen survivors. They're doing their laundry. We see that it gives the girls, a sense of normalcy. But as a result of working on this project, I learned that victims of trafficking are left to endure irreversible psychological damage as a result of their trauma. Here you see a young girl, she's in the bathroom. She's just come into the shelter and she's being supervised by one of the shelter's house moms. You see her in the doorway on the right-hand side. Many survivors of human trafficking, they suffer from extreme forms of post-traumatic stress, depression, and they experience thoughts of suicide following their abuse. So it's important that the house mom stays with this young woman just to make sure she doesn't hurt herself. But recovery, it's painful to watch, and for many, it's a lifelong process. But in the care of Voice of the Free, child survivors, they don't just receive shelter, they also receive psychological services, child care, welfare, case management, and they even go through job training. In these particular images, you see them engaging in wellness activities, such as tennis. You see a group of girls, and they're participating in a peer counseling group with a therapist. There's also a group here, and they're walking over to a classroom. They're participating in a home study program to finish their elementary and their secondary education. For the most part, these are girls that have been living at the shelter for more than a year. And these are survivors getting their lives back together. It's incredibly hopeful to see them going through this transition, seeing some of them smiling. For me, it really brings me hope that there is, hope at the end of the day that these girls are getting the care that they need. But for many survivors, part of their recovery is seeking justice and having their day in court. In this particular photograph, we see one of Voice of the Free's caseworkers. Her name is Karen Navarra. She's reviewing some investigation records with a survivor. And on this particular day, I traveled to the office of the city prosecutors in Manila with 6 girls for a hearing that could potentially bring their trafficker to justice. So on this particular day, each girl is reliving these feelings of a really painful past. And so there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of anxiety. Survivors, they endure a wait time of between 2 to 6 years for a court date to convict their trafficker. In this particular picture, we have one of the teen girls and she's waiting in the hallway for her case to be called. And unfortunately, after a 2.5-hour drive to Manila and 3 hours of waiting, the girls are informed that their day in court has been postponed due to the judge not having enough knowledge about human trafficking to hear their case. At that particular moment, tears begin to fall as the emotional toll of the day collapses on each of the girls. You know, at that moment, tears begin to fall, and here is a survivor in this particular photograph. She's embracing her caseworker. You know, there's just a lot of distress at that moment. As many human trafficking cases involving online sexual exploitation of children reach the courts in the Philippines, these cases are oftentimes, they're postponed because of inadequate resources. But during my time working with Voice of the Free, I had the pleasure of traveling with one of their field officers to Negros Island, to a province named Dumaguete. It's a lovely island where many tourists come to dive and they come to enjoy the sun. Here, Voice of the Free supports outreach prevention project named BK that I'm going to talk a little bit about. With these particular images, I want you to see what rural mountain life, village life looks like. Like I mentioned earlier, these are the types of communities that traffickers are coming to, hoping to sell the dream of a better life. So here we see a group of women. They're part of this outreach prevention group called Bente Comunidad, or BK for short. The group consists of about 80 members. Their mission is to work with local leaders to raise awareness about human trafficking and exploitation in their communities. The group also conducts leadership and social justice training. They conduct computer literacy programs. They have workshops on personal safety, stress management, how to build self-esteem, and even personal confidence. In this particular photo, this is their founder, and she's conducting a social justice program. But BK also leads a social enterprise named Ventures for Freedom. The social enterprise serves as a prevention program, which helps its members break the cycle of domestic servitude in their communities. Seen here, some of the women, they're working on sorting threaded pieces of clothing to make doormats. The sale of these doormats and other products that they make with these pieces of clothing, they generate enough income, helping the women become less vulnerable to being lured into trafficking by illegitimate job agencies. These efforts have made a big impact in their community because they allow the women to be productive in their own communities. This supportive and empowering group provides opportunities for its members, like Andrea. She's seen here with her daughter. As a survivor of domestic servitude, Andrea told me that the outreach program provided by BK is what helped her recognize that her own daughter was almost victimized by an illegitimate job agency. The agency had her daughter sign a contract to work as a domestic worker in Saudi Arabia. Because she was well informed about human trafficking and what it looks like in her community, she insisted on going with her daughter to the agency in Manila. Upon their arrival, they discovered that the agency didn't actually exist. So her daughter was going to be taken by a trafficker abroad. She would have gotten on a plane. They would have probably taken her passport. They wouldn't have probably allowed her to have any contact with anyone at home. They would have forced her to work as a domestic worker, or maybe she would have ended up in the sex trade. So this is just a photo of her daughter. And when I gave her daughter a chance to tell me her story, she immediately began to cry. And she said that she was so thankful to her mom for basically saving her life. So here she is here with her grandmother. I spent the afternoon with her. But being there and experiencing village life, I could easily see how a teenage girl could be tricked into leaving home, being sold the dream of moving abroad and having, a better life, and just being tricked and lured into trafficking. I could definitely see how these young girls are just like manipulated and tricked by these illegitimate job agencies when they come to these little small rural villages. As you can see, this project documents different aspects of human trafficking. You were able to get a glimpse of recovery of the girls in the shelter and aspects of what aftercare looks like, prosecution, the girls seeking justice through the courts, and even prevention programs in rural communities where organizations are tackling the root causes by providing job opportunities and building awareness. There are a lot of challenges, and that's why it's important to support organizations working to eradicate human trafficking. I hope this presentation encourages everyone to learn more about trafficking and look at what trafficking looks like in your own space, because it is something that is happening everywhere. Like I mentioned earlier, it happens in every country. It just looks a little different. I do encourage everyone to please come over to the Bridge Gallery and experience this beautiful exhibit. And I'd like to thank Glenn and Greg again for having me. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you for that, Maddie. That was just an incredible introduction into the human trafficking problem throughout the world, and with your extraordinary photographs. Why don't we open this up to Q&A, and if people want to ask a question, just unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and go ahead and ask your question. Although I do see one hand raised, so why don't I respond to that person first? Teresa Camosi, I see your hand raised. Why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
First, I am just taken by your work. It's very emotional and very necessary for the community, so thank you very much. Second, when did you begin the project, and how did you support yourself through the process?
This particular project I worked on about I would say it was 2.5 years ago now. And it was a personal project, so it is self-funded. I do travel on a shoestring. I stay in very reasonable places. Sometimes what happens is the NGO will accommodate me. And so I usually stay with the NGO. I've stayed in many shelters with survivors. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you for your good work.
Thank you so much for being here.
All right, let's see. I have a message to read Linda's question, but I don't see Linda's question.
I can read them, Glenn, if you
Yeah,
want.
go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, so Linda Hirsch sent some really interesting questions, Maddie. First of all, thank you. That was just a stunning presentation. She asked, was it necessary and possibly more difficult to communicate through an interpreter? And would it have been more challenging for a non-female photographer?
So I didn't need an interpreter. All the girls speak English. What was the second question? I'm sorry. It was interpreter.
If it had been more challenging for a non-female photographer to do this work.
I don't know. I feel that because I'm a female, that is my superpower in this work that I do. And I am very motherly. I'm a mom. And so I share that with the girls when I'm working with them. And so I don't know if, there are a lot of men out there that do a lot of incredible work, and they're very tender and very caring. So I don't want to say that men can't do this work, because I think they can. But yes, that's my superpower, being a woman. So thank you, Linda, for your question.
She also asked what kind of meditation has proven helpful.
In the healing garden, she's
Yeah.
asking about what kind of meditation they're doing.
Oh.
That I don't know. I didn't spend time meditating with the girls. That was just the space that they wanted to use to have their photographs taken. So that was a safe space for them. We do try to, as much as we can, we try to work in spaces that are chosen by the girls to make them feel safe and comfortable. So that's the space they chose.
Great. And she had one more. Are other arts taught to sustain their cultural roots and build self-esteem and support them through their PTSD?
Are there other art talks? Well, they do engage in art therapy. They do engage in karate. They also engage in playing tennis. As far as like aftercare programs, those are the three that I know of.
I see a question by Erin. Erin, can you unmute yourself? We got some feedback here. Let's see. Erin.
Hold on. Okay, I think that's better.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So question from Matilde, and this is a two-part question. The first one is, how do you care for your own emotional and mental health while helping to spread this mission and their word? And the second part is, how can we continue to support you? You mentioned a shoestring budget. Can you expand on perhaps the best way to continue to support?
Sure. So how do I take care of myself? I myself also spend a lot of time in nature. I live right by a conservation, so I spend a lot of time in the conservation. But one of my biggest supports is really coming home to the love of my family. It is very emotional, and I bottle up all these emotions while I'm working on a project because I want to be strength while I'm there, you know. So when I come home, it is emotional, it is hard, but I do have such a warm and supportive family. So they help me quite a bit. And your second question was, how do I support my work? How can people support the work that I do? There is a donation button on the Capture Humanity website. If you visit capturehumanity.com, you are more than welcome to donate and help fund a trip. So thank you for asking such thoughtful questions, Erin.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Erin.
We have a question in the chat from Sherry. How is your soul and spirit after this work and project? Are you staying in contact with the community and members you worked with?
Yeah, thanks to social media, I actually talk a lot to the girls in this particular project. Sometimes I'm not able to, like I've done projects like this even in refugee camps, and they don't have computers or anything, but fortunately for the girls in this particular group, I do get emails a lot from them. And even like doing this talk today, I actually reached out to many of them asking them if they could join us.
Does anybody else have questions? If you just like to unmute yourself and go ahead and just introduce yourself and ask the question, that's fine. Well, let me ask a question while maybe people are thinking of their questions. Maddie, you know, a large part of the end of your presentation was about the young girl from the Philippines who thought she was offered a legitimate job in Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, her mother intervened and stopped that. Is there a legitimate employment for domestic workers in Saudi Arabia, or in most cases, is it abusive and considered trafficking?
I think most cases of people, especially leaving the Philippines, I think that it is abusive. It is trafficking. There's even a law in the Philippines that you have to be a certain age to leave the country as a domestic worker. So it's a huge problem. And Voice of the Free also has a shelter at the airport. That's how much of a huge problem it is. So sometimes you have like 30 young girls getting on a flight and they have fraudulent birth certificates. And so these fraudulent job agencies are giving them false papers and they're trying to get through immigration. And if they're lucky, they get caught and they end up in the shelter. Those are the lucky ones, right? They don't know what's going on. They don't understand what is waiting for them when they get off that plane. So I think it's just a really huge problem. And NGOs like Voice of the Free, they are a really small NGO, and the work they do is really incredible because the problem is so big. So I give a lot of credit to Voice of the Free, and I'm really thankful that they hosted me so I could learn about this problem and give me the time and space to document.
We have a question from Sherry. What projects are next for you? Personal aspirations for your work and partners?
Well, I'm hoping to partner with an organization called Child Voice. They're in New Hampshire. They work with child soldiers in Uganda and in Nigeria. I have visited one of their sites in Uganda. You can look at some of that work on SDN actually. But I'm hoping to visit one of their sites in April in Nigeria. I'm also working on a short film. It's actually a 25-minute film on human trafficking in the state of Maine. I've been working on that particular project for a little bit more than 2 years. Due to COVID, it's definitely been slowed, but it's basically about the broad problem of human trafficking here in the US, and that it follows this one particular woman named Carrie Stewart through her ordeal of being trafficked through the US. So those are the projects I'm working on right now. Thank you for your question, Sherry.
Ola, I see you have a question that you don't know how to raise your hand, but that's okay. Just tell us what your question is.
Hi, Mati.
Hi, Olga.
Hey. I have a question. How you came up with all that? When did it start?
Okay, when did it start? So I'll give you the short answer to this. So about 6 years ago, I found myself in Myanmar and I was working on a documentary project. And I found myself in a nunnery. And in this nunnery, they had like maybe 250 children. And I didn't understand why was this a nunnery or was it an orphanage? I couldn't understand. And so then I was told that the reason why all these children were in the nunnery was because they were being safeguarded from human trafficking and being forced into marriage because of the conflict that was going on in the northern part of the country. So a lot of these children were Rohingya children, and a lot of their parents were bringing them to the orphanage to keep them safe. It was really the first time that I had been confronted by human trafficking. And so I was really curious about, what is this about? So I came home, I spent a lot of time on this US State Department website learning about trafficking. And from there, I started working on solely trafficking documentaries. And I learned really early on that I couldn't do this by myself. And so I started gathering people that could help me and support me through the storytelling. And so we also have survivors in our group that just make sure that our messaging stays on point and we're not doing any harm to any of the survivors that we're working with. That's incredibly important to us and to me, that we work from a trauma-informed kind of perspective while we're gathering these stories and also while we're sharing these stories. But that's really the short story to how this all started. Thank you for your question, Olga. Thank you so much for being here as well.
Carissa, I see your hand raised.
Hi. So I've followed your work for a bit, and I was wondering if your background in commercial, like portrait and wedding photography, has influenced how you work now, like from a stylistic standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. I do run a portrait business, and that's where I started. And it absolutely helps me in the work that I do because I feel like I treat the women and the girls that I photograph, I treat them like they're my commercial clients. I take that time to kind of get to know them. And even in between photos, I feel like I talk too much in between taking photos because I'm so curious about the people I photograph. So it definitely has helped me, helped train me to do the work that I do. I'm also a wedding photographer. So doing wedding photography, you know, you're always assessing light, you're rushing, you're composing things really quickly. So being out in the field, you know, doing weddings really kind of trains you for anything, right? So the answer is definitely yes. My commercial photography work has definitely helped me in doing the work that I do, definitely.
Thanks so much. The presentation was great.
Thank you so much for being here too.
Right, we have a question in the chat from David Huskin. The photos of the children in the shelters are in color, but the children out in the shelter and most of the organization are in black and white. Could you speak to this?
Sure. So the first half of these images are in color because I really felt that there's so much emotional heaviness in those images. I myself needed color to warm the subject matter for me personally. It's how I see those particular images. And the second half of the series, being in black and white, I didn't feel like emotionally those images are really heavy. And I really wanted to play with light. And so in those particular images, I felt like the stories were better told in black and white. And I really appreciate them more in black and white because of the lighting.
And another question in the chat from Joni McGee. Have you done work with human trafficking of Native American women? And thanks for your care and work.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I have done a little bit of work with Native American women. I have not been able to do any photography work with Native American women, but I have interviewed Native American women and talked to them about their experiences, but no photography as of yet.
And a question from Marilyn. Are there more girls than Voice of the Free can accommodate?
Are there more girls than boys being trafficked?
No, are there more girls than Voice of the Free can accommodate? Is there more of a demand for their
girls.
services?
No, that voice of the free, the organization can accommodate.
I think with most organizations, it's really accommodating boys is a little bit more difficult because there are so many more girls and a lot
I'm
of.
sorry, Maddie, I think you're misinterpreting the question. It's simpler than that. Are there just more girls than that they can accommodate?
Oh, yes, definitely. Sorry about that, Glenn. Yes, there are a lot of traffic survivors. Yeah, many more. They could definitely use the donations and the funding and the support.
Actually,
That's often the case, you know, with all these organizations that I work with. They're very grassroots. I'm there to help them with photography so I can deliver some high-end imagery, help them with storytelling because they can't afford it. And so a lot of these organizations, they're very grassroots. They could definitely use some funding. I would definitely recommend getting on their website and learning more about the work they do. They are amazing.
Actually, related to that, Maddie, I was wondering, because I just learned recently about how extensive trafficking is for boys as well. And I just wonder, in the course of your work, if you've come across any information on that.
Yeah, I think the problem with boys is there's so much shame. Not so much for labor trafficking, but for sex trafficking. I'm actually working with a gentleman in Maine who was trafficked as a child and through his adulthood. And he's, I think, he's 40 or 42 years old, and he's just coming out with his story now because he simply didn't think anyone would believe him. And that is the problem with boys. They're afraid because they're so full of shame. So organizations, they can't get to the boys unless they know what's going on. So there are boys definitely in sex trafficking and in all different kinds of labor trafficking, but that is the problem.
Thanks.
Any other questions out there, either through the chat or raising your hands or just unmuting yourself? Maddie, what are the best websites everybody can refer to?
The best websites are the Blue Campaign for the US State Department. They have a lot of information about trafficking, how to prevent trafficking, how to know what trafficking looks like. The Trafficking in Persons report that's also published by the US State Department is an amazing document of what trafficking looks like in almost every country in the world. They also rate trafficking and what countries are doing to prevent trafficking. And the other really great place I would go to is Polaris. They run the human trafficking hotline here in the US. That's a perfect place to also become more informed about trafficking, Polaris.
Do you know what the URL is?
Polaris.com.
And most of the discussion tonight has been about international trafficking. Can you just talk a bit about the problem here domestically?
Yeah, so here in the US, I mean, we do have a labor trafficking problem. People get trafficked into our country, and there are also people here that are native to our country that work on construction sites that are being trafficked, people that are working in restaurants, people that are working as domestics that maybe don't have paperwork, they're illegal, they end up in all kinds of work they're being threatened or coerced to work. And sex trafficking is a big problem in our country. It's not talked about enough on the news. But like I mentioned earlier, I've been working with many people in Maine who've been sex trafficked. And a lot of traffickers go to the state of Maine to lure these girls into trafficking. It's called the Romeo scenario, where a trafficker pretends to be someone that's interested in being a young woman's boyfriend. So, they wine and dine them, they groom them, they take them out to eat, they get them to get their hair done, and then they convince them to leave the state with them. And once they leave the state, that's when horror basically strikes. They get violently abused, sexually assaulted, and then they're made to prostitute themselves. And often these women come from broken homes, or they have drug abuse problems. So it's absolutely a problem here in our country. A lot of people that I speak to, when I tell them about the work that I do here in the US, they're always flabbergasted when I tell them that it happens also here in the United States. And I think a lot of Americans aren't aware that it's happening because it's such a hidden kind of crime, but it's absolutely happening. And the more that we understand and know about trafficking, the more we can do. And one of the things that we can do is we can look for local organizations just here in Boston, New Hampshire, and Maine. There are a lot of grassroots organizations even here that we can support and help and even volunteer for. Olga?
I have to unmute myself. Mati, what are your thoughts about human trafficking to America it's what's called a Russian wife? So the girl finds the man over the internet and comes here, and it's a deal. So you can pay for it. We are still $600. You can pay for it. I don't know how many $1,000 to get a citizenship or green card, or you can come and get a green card and be a prostitute for so-called husband. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know about that because it doesn't really sound like trafficking to me, to be honest with you, Olga, because there's no trafficker. It's one person making an agreement with someone else. And so that doesn't sound like trafficking to me. There has to be a trafficker, someone who's going to exploit a person for their own benefit. And it's usually through compelling them to do labor, some kind of labor. And it's only the trafficker that benefits from the labor. And it's usually done through, well, the legal definition is that it's done through force, fraud, or coercion. So there's threats involved, there's manipulation involved. There's a host of ways that you can manipulate someone to do something they really don't want to do, right? So there needs to be a trafficker that's benefiting from the exploitation.
Yeah, I just asked what do you think about it? The paid, traffic.
I think as long as the woman is consenting, that's really up to
No
her
problem,
or
right?
that person if they want to go into a contract where they're letting someone buy them into marriage. I mean, I don't really have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, as long as they're consenting, that's really their business. That's how I see that.
As long as they're adults, right?
Yeah, as long as they're adults. Absolutely, Glenn. And that's the other thing with Capture Humanity. Child rights are really important to us. It's always the safety of the child in showing these images and gathering these testimonials. We don't want to cause any harm, especially when it comes to children. It's really important to us that we're working with caseworkers and psychologists that are part of the NGO to make sure that we're checking and double checking to make sure that we're not causing any harm. Some of the girls where you see their faces are visible, those girls are child advocates. They work with the psychologists and they work with the caseworkers in the NGOs. So it's really important to us that we're always protecting the rights of children.
All right.
I have one more question. I'm gonna
Sure.
I'm gonna shut up. How many survivors you got so far?
How many survivors have I photographed or worked with? I've probably worked with
Roughly.
how many people are trafficked? Well, according to the International Labor Organization, their number is 40.3 million people. And that includes forced marriage. Forced marriage numbers are also included in the International Labor Organization numbers. The US State Department does not include forced marriage. So the US State Department reports that there are over 30 million people being trafficked. And so these are only people that we know of. There are many people still in captivity that we don't know of, right? So yes, there are a lot of people worldwide that are living in modern day slavery. It's a huge problem. And like I mentioned earlier, we don't spend enough time reporting on human trafficking. The media, you rarely hear media reports about trafficking. So I think it's definitely something that needs more attention. Because these survivors, they need care, the aftercare, the funding for aftercare for people that are being traumatized this way. It's just, the numbers are great, and they're going to get greater as people become more comfortable coming out and talking about their experience. Like the young woman that I'm working with in Maine, she says that the more that she talks and shares her story, more people approach her and tell her that they've had similar experiences. So more people are coming out and sharing that they've had these experiences. And here in the US, some of the vulnerabilities that make people vulnerable to trafficking are homelessness, children that are coming from broken homes, and unfortunately, people that have drug addictions. Traffickers are very drawn to people who have drug addictions because they can control them by giving them drugs and keeping them, using them over and over again, by selling them over and over again. They just give them drugs, they're out there and they're selling sex. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities, and there are a lot of communities here in the United States that, there are a lot of children that are coming out of broken homes. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities, and traffickers, they're scouting for victims, for vulnerable children outside of shopping malls. Social media, Google and Facebook are huge platforms for traffickers to be scouting for vulnerable kids, especially kids that don't have parents that are really, involved parents. There are a lot of kids that come from broken homes.
All right. Well, thank you, Maddie. This has been an incredible experience tonight, both your photographs and the education that you provided us about this problem, really. And it's been a great attendance. Thank you all for being here. Greg, would you like to close out and say a few final words?
I will step in. Yes. First of all, thank you for everybody that took the time to log on and come to this. It's not as much fun as seeing everybody in the same room, but it's really great. Thank you for caring about photography and about photographers who are doing important stuff. I'd like to thank, obviously, Glenn and Barbara from the Social Documentary Network, and Eric Ludens from Digital Silver Imaging, who's, you know, the two of them or the three of them are just great supporters of photographers and photography in the area, and supporters of this gallery. We are going to continue to be here and fight our way through this COVID thing. We've got all kinds of things coming up in the this year, and I encourage you, if you're interested in photography, to go to the website and get your name on the mailing list so you'll be aware of other things going on. And did I thank Maddie? I'm not sure. That was the most important person to thank, for coming out on a cold night and leaving your kids out in the car. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It was a great program, and I'm glad she did it here. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Greg, tell us the website for the gallery.
Bridge.photos.
Can you text it, Glenn, please?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat.
Bridge.photos, and we also this particular show that's up, I'm posting one photograph every day on Instagram from it. So, go to @Bridge Photo Gallery, and you'll see a photograph a day. And tomorrow, probably one of Maddie's. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, everybody. And why don't you unmute yourselves and applaud Maddie.
Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you, Greg.
Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Night.
See you soon. Oh my goodness.
That's good. That's pretty good.
You have to do that.
Wow.
You know, human trafficking sucks.
There's a hot mic, Olga. Watch what you say.